The wager no one should have made in a smoke-choked saloon where desperate men gambled away everything they owned, a silent woman with eyes like winter storm clouds sat motionless at a poker table, her hands never trembling, her expression carved from stone. They laughed when she walked in, a woman, alone, weaponless except for the stillness that made grown men shift in their chairs. They stopped laughing when she started winning. And when Harlan Pike, drunk and ruined, threw down his final bet, a mail-order husband waiting at the freight office like unclaimed cargo, the room erupted. She didn't smile. She didn't speak. She simply pushed her cards forward and won a man she never wanted. If you're ready to discover how a woman who won a man in a card game became the only person who could set him free, stay with me until the end. And when you do, hit that like button and comment your city below. I want to see how far this story travels. The air inside McCready's saloon tasted like ash and broken promises. May Crow sat perfectly still at the corner poker table, her back to the wall, her dark eyes tracking every movement in the room with the precision of a hawk watching field mice. The other players, 5 men who'd started the night flush with bravado and whiskey, now slouched in their chairs like deflated bellows, their coin piles reduced to pathetic scraps of metal that clinked weakly when they shoved them forward. She hadn't spoken a single word since sitting down 3 hours ago. The silence unnerved them more than any threat could have. "You cheating?" The question came from a thick-necked ranch hand named Dooley, his face flushed red from drink and humiliation. His fingers drummed against the table's scarred surface, each tap a little declaration of impotent rage. May's expression didn't change. She simply placed her cards face down on the table and waited. "I asked you a question, woman." The word woman carried all the contempt he could muster, as if her gender itself was an insult to the sacred ritual of men losing money to each other in dark rooms that smelled of tobacco spit and failure. "She ain't cheatin', Dooley." This from an older man with a prospector's weathered face and eyes that had seen enough of the world to recognize when someone was simply better. "She's just better than you, better than all of us, seems like." Dooley's chair scraped back. His hand moved toward his belt. May's hand moved faster. Not to a weapon, she carried none visible. Just a subtle shift, fingers spreading flat against the table, weight redistributing in her chair. The movement was so slight, so economical, that most men would have missed it entirely. Dooley didn't miss it. He froze, his hand hovering over his belt buckle, suddenly uncertain whether he was reaching for his gun or his pants. The moment stretched out like taffy, sticky and uncomfortable, until he slowly lowered his hand and sat back down, muttering curses into his whiskey glass. "Smart choice," the prospector said mildly. The dealer, a nervous man whose name nobody remembered and nobody cared to learn, cleared his throat and reached for the deck with trembling fingers. "Next hand, gentlemen, and lady." He added the last word like an afterthought, like he was still processing the fact that a woman had walked into McCready's 3 hours ago and proceeded to methodically dismantle every man at the table without saying a single goddamn word. The cards whispered against the felt as he dealt. Mee picked up her hand without looking at it, her gaze instead fixed on the saloon's entrance, where the batwing doors occasionally swung inward to admit the cold October wind and the smell of horse dung from the street. She'd positioned herself perfectly, back to the wall, clear view of both entrances, close enough to the rear exit that she could be through it in 3 seconds if trouble arrived wearing a badge or a grudge. She'd learned a long time ago that survival wasn't about being the fastest gun or the strongest fighter. It was about being the person who saw trouble coming while everyone else was still counting their money. "Your bet, Miss Crow." She slid $3 silver forward without looking at her cards. The other players exchanged glances. Some folded immediately. Others, driven by pride or stupidity or that particular brand of masculine stubbornness that insisted they couldn't possibly lose to a woman again, matched her bet and raised. By the time the hand played out, May had added another $12 to her pile. She still hadn't looked at her cards. "Jesus Christ," Dooley breathed. She ain't even, you didn't even, fold better next time," May said. Her voice was like wind over empty plains, soft, but carrying the kind of coldness that promised winter was coming whether you were ready or not. It was the first time she'd spoken all night. The table went quiet. Even the background noise of the saloon seemed to dim. The off-key piano in the corner, the laughter from the bar, the shuffle of boots on floorboards. Everything contracted down to this moment, this table, this woman who'd just proven she could win without even looking at the cards in her hand. "Deal again," the prospector said quietly. He was down to his last few coins, but he pushed them forward anyway. "One more hand." The dealer obliged, his hand still shaking. This time, May looked at her cards. A slight tightening around her eyes. Not quite a smile, not quite a frown. Just acknowledgement. The betting went around the table. Men folded or raised or called with the desperate energy of gamblers who'd already lost more than they could afford, but couldn't bring themselves to walk away. It was a sickness, May knew. She'd seen it in mining camps and cattle towns, in riverboat parlors and military barracks. The sickness of hope mixed with humiliation, of needing just one more hand to break even, to reclaim dignity, to prove that luck hadn't permanently abandoned them. She didn't suffer from that sickness. She played cards the way she lived, with cold calculation and no expectation of mercy from the universe. By the time the final hand played out, only two players remained, May and a man she hadn't noticed before. He sat at the far end of the table, half hidden in shadow, his face obscured by the brim of a battered hat. He hadn't said much during the game, hadn't drawn attention to himself. But his pile of coins had remained relatively stable, which meant he knew what he was doing, or at least knew when to fold. "Harlan Pike," the prospector said, noticing May's gaze. "Railroad man, or was, before the company let him go for indiscretions." Pike lifted his head just enough for lamplight to catch the edge of his face, gaunt, unshaven, the kind of weathered that came from hard living rather than honest work. "I'm still in," he said. His voice had the rough quality of a man who'd spent too many nights shouting over train engines and too many mornings regretting it. "Unless the lady wants to fold." "Show your cards," May said. Pike spread his hand on the table. 3 queens. Not a bad hand, good enough to win most pots against most players. May laid down 4 tens. The air went out of the room. Pike stared at the cards like they'd personally betrayed him. His mouth worked soundlessly for a moment, opening and closing like a landed fish gasping for water it would never find. "That's..." He swallowed hard. "That's everything I got." "Then you shouldn't have bet it," May said. She reached for the pot, a respectable pile of coins and crumpled bills that represented several weeks' worth of honest work, or one night of dishonest gambling, depending on your perspective. "Wait." Pike's hand shot out, not quite touching her wrist but hovering close enough to make his intention clear. Several men at nearby tables noticed the gesture. Hands moved subtly toward weapons. The room's energy shifted from relaxed to razor edge in the space of a heartbeat. May didn't move. She simply looked at Pike's outstretched hand, then at his face, with an expression that suggested she was calculating exactly how many bones she'd need to break to make her point. "I got one more bet," Pike said quickly. "One more thing to wager." "You just said that was everything." "Everything I got. Not everything I can offer." The prospector leaned back in his chair, suddenly very interested. "This ought to be good." Pike licked his lips. His eyes darted around the table, looking for support or sympathy, and finding neither. When he spoke again, his voice carried the manic edge of a man who'd just realized he was standing on a cliff's edge and had decided that jumping was preferable to climbing back. "There's a man," he said, "at the freight office, name of Elias Ward. Come in on the train yesterday from Pennsylvania. He's a mail-order husband, paid his passage out here to marry a widow woman name of Catherine somebody. I was supposed to pick him up, deliver him to her ranch up in the hills." "And?" May's voice was flat, uninterested. "And the widow died 3 weeks ago. Cholera. Nobody told Ward because nobody knew how to reach him. He was already on the train by the time she took sick. Now he's just sitting at the freight office like unclaimed baggage, too broke to buy a ticket back east and too proud to admit he made the trip for nothing." The table had gone very quiet again, but this was a different kind of quiet. This was the silence of men watching something wrong unfold and not being quite sure whether to intervene or enjoy the spectacle. "You can't bet a person," the dealer said weakly. "The hell I can't. I got his contract right here." Pike pulled a folded paper from his vest pocket and slapped it on the table. "Signed and legal. Man agreed to marry whoever held this paper." That was supposed to be Catherine, but seeing as she's dead and gone, contract defaults to whoever was handling the transaction. "That's me." That ain't how contracts work, the prospector objected. It is in territories without proper courts. I checked with a lawyer. Well, a man who used to be a lawyer before he got disbarred for drinking, but he knew his business. This here's a legal document transferring one man's obligation to whoever holds the paper. May finally looked at the contract. She didn't touch it, didn't pick it up. Just looked at it the way she might examine a dead snake on the road, with detached curiosity about how something so pathetic had managed to cause any trouble at all. You're betting a human being, she said. I'm betting a contract, Pike corrected. What you do with it after you win, if you win, that's your business. Harlan, this is low even for you, Dooley muttered. Says the man who lost his horse to me last month and tried to bet his daughter's wedding ring 3 nights back. Pike shot back. Don't act righteous now. The dealer looked at May. You don't have to accept this, Miss Crow. It ain't right. For a long moment, May sat perfectly still. She could walk away, take her winnings, more money than she'd seen in 6 months, and disappear into the night like she always did. Move on to the next town, the next game, the next anonymous room where she could sit with her back to the wall and let the hours pass in silence. She could walk away. But something in Pike's desperate, sweating face made her pause. Something in the way he was willing to trade another human being like livestock, as if people were just property to be wagered and won, as if a man's entire future was worth less than the cost of one more hand of cards. She'd seen that attitude before, had lived under it, had survived it, had killed men for embodying it. What's in the pot? She asked. Pike blinked, not understanding. What? Current pot. What are you betting alongside this contract? Pike looked down at the pitiful scattering of coins in front of him, maybe $2 in mixed silver and copper, barely enough to buy a decent meal. This and the contract, he said. All or nothing. May studied him for a long moment. Then she reached into her own pile and extracted a single gold eagle. $10, more than Pike had probably seen in one piece in months. She placed it carefully on top of her existing bet. Call, she said. Show your cards. Pike's hand shook as he laid them out. 2 pairs, aces and 8s. Dead man's hand. The irony wasn't lost on anyone at the table. May spread her cards slowly, deliberately, giving Pike time to process what he was seeing. A straight flush, queen high, in hearts. The color drained from Pike's face. No, he whispered. No, that ain't, you can't. I can. May pulled the pot toward herself, coins clinking softly as they joined her pile. Then very carefully, she picked up the contract and unfolded it. The paper was creased and stained, handled too many times by too many hands, but the words were clear enough. This document certifies that Elias Ward of Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, has entered into lawful agreement to provide marital service in exchange for passage, room, and board as arranged by Catherine Moss of Broken Creek, Montana Territory. The rest was legal language that basically confirmed what Pike had said. Whoever held the contract held the obligation, and the obligation included a man who'd traveled 2,000 miles to marry a woman who'd died before he arrived. May folded the contract and tucked it into her vest pocket. You can't do this, Pike said, his voice rising. You can't just take a man like he's property? May stood up, gathering her winnings into a leather pouch with economical movements. Seems like you already did that when you bet him. But you don't understand. There's men I owe money to, and you thought wrong. May's voice was cold enough to freeze whiskey. You gambled. You lost. That's how it works. She turned to leave, her boots making soft sounds on the floorboard. Behind her, Pike made a choking sound, rage or despair or both mixed together. You don't even want him, he shouted. What are you going to do with a mail-order husband? You ain't exactly the marrying type. May paused at the threshold, her back still to the table. For a moment, the only sound was the distant piano and the whisper of wind through the bat-wing doors. Maybe I'll set him free, she said quietly. Maybe that'll make me different from you. Then she was gone, stepping out into the October night where frost was already forming on the wooden sidewalks and the stars overhead burned cold and distant as chips of ice in a black sky. The freight office sat at the edge of town, a squat building made of logs and ambition, with a hand-painted sign that read, Montana Freight and Passenger Service. Arrivals and Departures. A single lamp burned in the window, casting yellow light across the hitching post where two tired horses stood with their heads down, dreaming whatever horses dream about when the day is done and the night is cold. May approached slowly, her hand resting on the pouch of coins at her belt, not because she expected trouble, but because expecting nothing was how people ended up dead in ditches. The door stood slightly ajar. She pushed it open with her boot, letting it swing wide before she entered. Old habit. Give any threats inside a chance to reveal themselves before you committed to the space. The freight office's interior smelled like wood smoke and old paper. Crates and trunks lined the walls, stacked haphazardly with the kind of carelessness that suggested the freight master didn't expect most of them to be claimed anytime soon. A pot-bellied stove radiated heat from the corner, and behind a scarred wooden counter, a clerk with ink-stained fingers looked up from his ledger. "We're closed," he said automatically, then saw May's face and reconsidered. "Unless you got urgent business." "I'm here for Elias Ward." The clerk's eyebrows rose. "You miss Catherine's people." "I hold his contract." "That's so?" The clerk set down his pen and studied her with the frank curiosity of a man who spent his days processing human cargo and had thought he'd seen every variation of frontier desperation. "Got proof?" May pulled out the contract and laid it on the counter. The clerk read it slowly, his lips moving slightly as he processed the legal language. When he finished, he looked up at May with something that might have been pity or might have been respect. It was hard to tell in the lamplight. "He's in the back," the clerk said. "Been there since yesterday. Won't hardly talk, won't hardly eat. Just sits there like he's waiting for someone to tell him what to do next." He paused. "You planning to honor the contract?" "I'm planning to figure out what I'm planning," May said. The clerk grunted. "Fair enough. He's all yours, I suppose. Though I gotta say, miss, this whole situation don't sit right with me. Man ain't cargo, no matter what that paper says." "Agreed." The clerk blinked, surprised. Then he nodded slowly and gestured toward a door at the back of the office. "Through there. And miss, be gentle with him. He's had a rough go of it." May walked to the back door and pushed it open. The room beyond was small and windowless, lit by a single candle that had burned down to a stub. Wooden benches lined the walls, and on one of them sat a man. He looked up when the door opened, and in that first moment of lamplight, May saw everything she needed to know. Young. Maybe 25, though it was hard to tell. Soft hands that had never worked a day outside of whatever clerk's office or shop had employed him back east. Dark hair that needed cutting. Eyes that held the particular kind of exhaustion that comes from realizing the future you'd imagined has died before you could reach it. He wore a suit, threadbare but clean, the kind of garment a poor man buys when he needs to make a good impression. His collar was buttoned up despite the heat from the stove, and his hands rested on his knees with the rigid posture of someone trying very hard to maintain dignity in a situation that had stripped him of almost everything else. "Are you Catherine?" he asked. His voice was quiet, educated, Eastern. The accent of Philadelphia or Boston, somewhere civilization had smoothed the rough edges off vowels and taught men to speak in complete sentences. "No," May said. The hope that had briefly flickered in his eyes died. "Oh. Catherine's dead." He flinched like she'd slapped him. I didn't know. Nobody told me. Nobody knew how." Elias Ward sat very still for a moment, processing this information. Then, slowly, his shoulders sagged, not dramatically, but with the quiet defeat of a man who'd been holding himself together through sheer force of will and had just run out of will to force. "So I came all this way for nothing," he said softly. "Looks like. And now He gestured vaguely at himself, at the room, at the entire absurd situation. "What exactly am I now?" May pulled out the contract and held it up. "According to this, you're mine." His face went white. "What?" "Won you in a card game. Fair and square, if anything about this situation could be called fair." She walked closer, studying him the way she might study a horse she was considering buying, looking for signs of lameness, weakness, defects that might cause problems down the road. Elias stood up slowly, his hands clenching into fists at his sides. Not threatening. He didn't look like he could threaten a barn cat, but defensive, protective of what little dignity he had left. "I'm not property," he said. I know. You can't just own a person. I know that too. Then why? Because the man who was supposed to deliver you to Catherine decided you were worth less than a poker pot, and I decided I'd rather you end up with me than with him. May folded the contract and tucked it back into her vest. Whether that's better or worse for you remains to be seen. Elias stared at her, trying to make sense of what was happening. His educated brain, trained to parse contracts and ledgers and the neat columns of civilized business, couldn't quite process the reality of being traded like livestock in a frontier saloon. "What are you going to do with me?" he asked finally. May considered the question. Honest answer? She had no idea. She hadn't thought past the moment of watching Harlan Pike's face crumble when he realized he'd lost. Hadn't considered what came after the satisfaction of denying a man who'd tried to trade another human being like a sack of grain. For now? She turned toward the door. You're coming with me. We'll figure out the rest later. And if I refuse? May paused, her hand on the doorframe. Then you can stay here in this room with no money and no way home, waiting for Pike's creditors to remember he promised them a man who could work off his debts. I'm sure there'll be real understanding about your philosophical objections to the situation. Elias's jaw tightened. That's not a choice. No, May agreed. It's not, but it's the only one you've got right now. She walked out without looking back, trusting that he'd follow or he wouldn't. Either way, she'd done more for him than Pike ever would have. The sound of footsteps behind her confirmed his decision. Outside, frost had turned the dirt street into something that crunched underfoot. The saloon's noise had died down to a murmur. It was late enough that even the dedicated drunks were starting to think about finding somewhere horizontal to pass out. May's horse stood where she'd left it, tied to a post in front of the general store. A gray mare with the kind of calm temperament that came from having seen everything the frontier could throw at her and deciding none of it was worth getting excited about. Elias stopped when he saw the horse. We're leaving? Tonight? You got somewhere better to be? He looked back at the town, at the handful of buildings huddled together against the vast darkness of the Montana plains. No, I suppose I don't. May untied the mare and swung up into the saddle in one smooth motion. Then she looked down at Elias, who was standing there in his threadbare suit, like a man who'd just realized he was about to step off a cliff and wasn't sure whether he'd fly or fall. You can ride? She asked. Yes, a little. I worked in a stable when I was younger. Good enough. She held out her hand. Come on. He stared at her outstretched hand like it was a snake that might bite. Then, very carefully, he took it. His hand was soft, just like she'd expected. No calluses, no roughness from outdoor work. The hand of a clerk or a shopkeeper. Someone who'd spent his life indoors pushing papers and counting other people's money. She pulled him up behind her, settling him onto the mare's broad back. Hold on, she said. To what? To me. Unless you want to fall off and break your neck before we even get out of town. Hesitantly, his hands found her waist. The touch was so light, so tentative, that she almost couldn't feel it through her coat. Harder than that, she said. I won't break. His grip tightened slightly, still cautious, but more secure. May kicked the mare into an easy walk, heading north out of town toward the open plains where the stars burned brighter and the air tasted clean instead of smoke and sweat and desperate ambition. Behind them, Broken Creek's few lights dwindled into the darkness. Ahead, nothing but empty land and cold stars and questions neither of them knew how to answer yet. They rode in silence for the first hour. Elias's hand stayed locked around May's waist, his grip gradually relaxing as he got used to the rhythm of the horse's movement. She could feel him shivering. The suit that had been adequate for a heated freight office was desperately insufficient for a Montana night in October. Without speaking, she reached back and pulled a blanket from her saddlebag, handing it to him over her shoulder. He took it after a moment's hesitation. Thank you. She didn't respond. Another hour passed. The moon rose, 3/4 full, painting the landscape in shades of silver and shadow. The plains stretched out endlessly in all directions, rolling grassland that would be golden in summer, but now looked gray and ghostly in the moonlight. Where are we going? Elias asked finally. His voice was quiet, almost lost in the sound of the horse's hooves and the whisper of wind through dry grass. Away. That's not an answer. It's the only one I've got. He fell silent again, but she could feel the tension in his hands, the way his body had gone rigid with frustration or fear or both. I need to stop, she said eventually, more to break the silence than because the mare was tired. She guided the horse toward a small depression in the land where a few scrubby trees provided minimal shelter from the wind. It wasn't much, but it was better than nothing. Elias slid off the mare's back with less grace than she'd hoped for, stumbling slightly when his feet hit the ground. He caught himself before falling, but barely. City legs, May observed. I haven't ridden in years, he said defensively, and I've never ridden all night across. He gestured at the vast emptiness around them. Across this. May dismounted and started unsaddling the mare, her movements practiced and efficient. You'll get used to it, will I? There was something sharp in his voice now, an edge of anger finally cutting through the shock and exhaustion. Because from where I'm standing, it seems like I don't get a say in much of anything anymore. She paused in her work, looking at him over the mare's back. In the moonlight, his face was pale and drawn, his eyes shadowed with exhaustion and something harder to name. You want to have this conversation now? She asked. I want to have some conversation. Any conversation that explains what happens next. May finished unsaddling the mare and set the gear aside. Then she pulled out a canvas tarp and began constructing a basic shelter, just enough to block the worst of the wind. Help me with this, she said. For a moment she thought he'd refuse, thought he'd stand there in his inadequate suit and his righteous anger and demand answers she didn't have. But he didn't. He came over and took the edge of the tarp she held out to him, following her instructions to stake it down without complaint. When they finished, she gestured to the small protected space beneath the tarp. Get some sleep. I'm not tired. You're exhausted. I can see it from here. I don't want to sleep, he said stubbornly. I want answers. May sat down on her saddle blanket and pulled out a piece of jerky from her pack, tearing off a chunk with her teeth. She chewed slowly, watching him stand there in the moonlight, shivering and proud and utterly lost. All right, she said finally. Ask. He blinked, surprised. What? You want answers. Ask your questions. Elias stood there for a moment, visibly collecting himself. Then he sat down across from her, carefully, like he was afraid the ground might betray him too. Who are you? He asked. May Crow. That's a name, not an answer. It's the only answer you need right now. His jaw tightened. Fine. Where are we going? North. We're north. Far enough that Harlan Pike and his creditors won't find us. And then what? May took another bite of jerky, chewing slowly while she considered how much truth to give him. Then I figure out what to do with you. I'm not a problem to be solved, he said quietly. No. She met his eyes. You're not. But you're also not my responsibility, not my obligation, and not my choice. Pike made you my problem when he put you up as a bet. I'm just trying to figure out the best way to unproblem you. You could let me go. Go where? You got money for a train ticket? Got family back east who'll take you in? Got any skills that'll keep you fed out here? His silence was answer enough. That's what I thought. May pulled out a second piece of jerky and tossed it to him. Eat, then sleep. Tomorrow we'll ride until we find somewhere safe enough to make better plans. Elias caught the jerky and stared at it like it was a puzzle he couldn't quite solve. Why are you doing this? Doing what? Helping me, feeding me. You could have just left me at the freight office. Could have sold the contract to someone else. Could have done a lot of things, May interrupted. But I didn't. And standing around wondering why won't change what is. She lay down on her blanket, pulling her coat tight around herself and closed her eyes. Get some sleep, Elias Ward. Morning comes early out here, and it won't care whether you're ready for it or not. For a long time she heard him sitting there, the rustle of his suit, the soft sound of his breathing, the occasional crunch as he finally ate the jerky she'd given him. Eventually she heard him lie down too. And eventually, despite everything, she heard his breathing slow and deepen into the rhythm of exhausted sleep. Only then did May let herself truly relax, her hand resting on the knife at her belt, her senses still half alert for danger, even as her body finally acknowledged its own exhaustion. She'd won a man in a card game. Now she had to figure out what that meant, for both of them. Dawn broke pale and cold across the plains, painting the sky in shades of gray that promised nothing good. May woke the way she always did, instantly, completely, her hand already on her knife before her eyes fully opened. The habit was so ingrained that she didn't even think about it anymore. It was simply what survival looked like after enough years of sleeping in places where hesitation meant death. Elias still slept, curled on his side beneath the blanket she'd given him, his breathing soft and even. In sleep, he looked younger than he had last night, vulnerable in a way that made something uncomfortable shift in May's chest. She pushed the feeling aside and stood up, her joints stiff from the cold ground and the long ride. The mare grazed nearby, unconcerned with the dawn or the two humans who'd disturbed her night. May checked the horse's legs and hooves with practiced efficiency, then refilled her canteen from the small creek that ran through the depression. The water was ice cold and tasted of minerals and distance. "We should keep moving." Elias's voice made her turn. He was sitting up now, the blanket wrapped around his shoulders like a cape, his hair sticking up at odd angles. He looked miserable and exhausted, and somehow still determined to maintain whatever dignity he had left. "Soon," May said. She pulled out some dried biscuits from her pack and tossed one to him. "Eat first." He caught it awkwardly and stared at the hard circle of flour and lard like it might bite him. "What is this?" "Food. It looks like a rock." "It'll taste like one too, but it'll keep you going." She bit into her own biscuit, the dry crumbs sticking in her throat. "Hardtack, standard trail food." Elias took a tentative bite and immediately made a face. "This is awful." "You'll get used to it." "That's what you said about the writing." "Still true." May finished her biscuit and started packing up the camp with the same economical movement she'd used to set it up. "We've got maybe 30 miles to cover today, maybe more, depending on how well you hold up." 30 miles? He stood up, wincing as his muscles protested. "On horseback?" "Unless you'd prefer to walk." He looked down at his soft leather shoes, city shoes, completely inadequate for the terrain they'd be crossing, and his expression went carefully blank. "The horse is fine." They rode through the morning in silence, broken only by the sound of hooves on grass and the occasional cry of a hawk overhead. The sun climbed higher but brought little warmth, and the wind that swept across the plains carried the promise of winter in its teeth. Elias's hands around May's waist had lost their tentative quality. Now he held on with the grim determination of a man who'd realized that falling off would mean walking, and walking meant death. His body moved with the horse's rhythm more naturally than it had last night, adjusting to the motion through sheer necessity. Around noon, May spotted a line of cottonwoods in the distance, the telltale sign of water. She guided the mare toward them, and sure enough, a small stream cut through the grassland, its banks lined with trees that had turned gold with autumn. "We'll stop here," she said, dismounting. "Water the horse, rest a bit." Elias slid off the mare's back and immediately sat down hard on the ground, his legs refusing to support him. He didn't complain, but May saw the way his jaw tightened, the way his hands clenched into fists. "First long ride's always the worst," she said, leading the mare to the stream. "Tomorrow will hurt more, but after that it gets easier." "Wonderful," he muttered. May let the mare drink her fill, then tied her to a low-hanging branch where she could graze on the grass that grew thick near the water. When she turned back, Elias had managed to stand up and was attempting to walk toward the stream, his gait stiff and awkward. "You need to stretch," May said, "or you'll seize up completely." "I don't need advice on—" He stopped mid-sentence as his leg cramped, forcing him to grab onto a tree trunk for support. "Fine. How do I stretch?" She showed him, simple movements to loosen the muscles that had been locked in riding position for hours. He followed her instructions without comment, though she could see the effort it took him to swallow his pride and accept help. When he finished, he limped to the stream and knelt down, cupping water in his hands and drinking deeply. Then he splashed some on his face, washing away the dust and exhaustion as best he could. "Can I ask you something?" he said, still kneeling by the water. "You can ask. Doesn't mean I'll answer." He turned to look at her, water dripping from his chin. "Last night you said Pike bet me because he owed money to people. Dangerous people, I'm guessing." "That'd be a safe guess." "So those people might come looking for him, and when they don't find him—" He paused. "They might come looking for me instead." May pulled out another piece of jerky and tore off a chunk. They might. And you knew that when you took the contract. I did. So you didn't just win a man in a card game, you won a target. She looked at him with something that might have been respect. You're smarter than you look. I worked in an accounting firm in Philadelphia, he said quietly. I know how debts work. And I know that men who lend money to gamblers don't just forget about it when the gambler disappears. True enough. So why? He stood up, his voice gaining strength. Why take on that risk? You could have walked away. Let Pike deal with his own mess. May was quiet for a long moment, watching the stream flow past, clear and cold and indifferent to human concerns. You ever see a dog get kicked? She asked finally. The question clearly threw him. What? A dog. Getting kicked by someone bigger and meaner who knows the dog can't fight back. Yes. When I was a child, there was a man in our neighborhood who... He stopped, his expression darkening with memory. Yes, I've seen it. And did you stop it? I tried. He hit me too, told me to mind my own business. But you tried anyway. Elias's jaw tightened. Yes. That's why. May turned away from the stream and started walking back toward the mare. Sometimes you see something wrong happening and you have two choices. Walk away and live with it, or don't walk away and live with whatever comes next. I chose not to walk away. Even though it puts you in danger? Danger's relative out here. Everything's dangerous if you think about it long enough. They rode through the afternoon, the landscape gradually changing from flat grassland to rolling hills dotted with rocky outcroppings. The air grew colder as they climbed higher and clouds began gathering on the horizon, dark and heavy with the promise of rain or worse. Storm coming, May said, more to herself than to Elias. How can you tell? The way the wind's shifting, the smell in the air, the way the mare's ears keep flicking back. She scanned the horizon, looking for shelter. We need to find somewhere to hole up before it hits. How long do we have? Hour, maybe less. She kicked the mares into a faster pace, heading toward a rocky ridge she'd spotted to the west. If they were lucky, there'd be an overhang or a cave, something to keep them dry when the storm broke. The first drops of rain started falling just as they reached the ridge. May guided the mare along the base of the rocks, her eyes scanning for any opening, any shadow that might indicate shelter. There, a dark gap between two massive boulders, partially hidden by scrub brush. She dismounted quickly and pushed through the brush, peering into the darkness. It was shallow, barely more than a cleft in the rock, but it was deep enough to keep them out of the worst of the weather. Get down, she told Elias. Help me get the gear inside. They worked quickly, pulling the saddle and packs off the mare and dragging them into the shelter. The rain was falling harder now, fat drops that hit like pebbles, and the sky had turned the color of old bruises. May tied the mare to a sturdy bush just outside the shelter, positioning her so she'd have some protection from the rock face. The horse didn't look happy about the arrangement, but she didn't fight it either. Thunder rumbled in the distance, low and threatening. Get inside, May said to Elias, who was still standing in the rain like he wasn't sure what to do with himself. He ducked into the shelter and she followed, pulling their gear deeper into the cleft, just as the sky opened up completely. The rain came down in sheets, driven by wind that howled through the rocks like something alive and angry. Lightning split the sky, turning everything white for a heartbeat before plunging it back into gray darkness. The thunder that followed shook the ground beneath them. In the shelter, pressed close together by necessity rather than choice, May and Elias sat in silence and listened to the storm rage. I've never seen weather like this, Elias said eventually, his voice barely audible over the wind and rain. In Philadelphia, we got storms, but nothing like... Lightning flashed again, and he flinched. Nothing like this. Out here, weather can kill you as easy as a bullet, May said. She was checking their supplies, making sure everything was protected from the moisture that was already seeping into their shelter. You learn to respect it, or you don't last long. Is that how you learned? By almost dying? Something like that. He was quiet for a moment, watching her work. Then, can I help? She glanced at him, surprised. You know how to check saddle leather for water damage? No, but I can learn. She handed him the saddle blanket. Feel along the edges. If the wool's starting to felt up from moisture, we need to dry it out before it mildews. He took the blanket and began examining it with the careful attention of someone who'd spent his life dealing with details. His hands moved methodically, checking each section, and when he found a spot that felt wrong, he showed it to her without hesitation. Like this? Yeah, good eye. She took the blanket and hung it on a rock projection where air could circulate around it. You might not be completely useless out here after all. It was meant to be teasing, but it came out sharper than she'd intended. Elias's expression closed off, and he went back to checking the other gear without responding. The storm raged for hours. They sat in the cramped shelter, their bodies close enough that May could feel the heat radiating from Elias despite the cold air. She found herself acutely aware of his presence, the sound of his breathing, the slight movements he made when he shifted position, the way his shoulder occasionally brushed against hers in the tight space. It had been a long time since she'd been this close to another person for this long, without violence being involved. "Why don't you talk?" Elias asked suddenly. "I talk. Not like normal people. You use 10 words when most people would use 100. 10 words gets the job done. But don't you ever want—" He trailed off, searching for the right words. "Don't you ever want to just talk? About nothing in particular? Just to hear another voice?" May was quiet for a long moment, listening to the rain hammer against the rocks. "Talking makes people think you're friends. Being friends makes you care what happens to them. Caring gets you killed. That's a lonely way to live. It's a living way to live, which is more than I can say for the friends I used to have." The bitterness in her voice surprised even her. She hadn't meant to say that, hadn't meant to reveal anything beyond the hard shell she kept between herself and the world. Elias didn't press. He just nodded slowly, like he understood something he couldn't quite put into words. Outside, the storm began to ease. The rain softened from a roar to a steady drum, and the thunder moved off toward the east, grumbling like a disappointed predator denied its prey. "Tell me about Philadelphia," May said, surprising herself again. Elias looked at her, clearly caught off guard by the request. "What do you want to know?" "Anything. What was it like?" He thought for a moment, his expression distant with memory. "Crowded. Loud. You could walk down a street and hear 10 different languages being spoken. Smell food from a dozen different countries all mixed together. See buildings 3 and 4 stories tall packed so close together you could barely see the sky between them." Sounds awful. Sometimes it was, but sometimes— He smiled slightly, the first real smile she'd seen from him. "Sometimes it was wonderful. There was this bakery near my boarding house, run by an old German woman who made bread that tasted like heaven. And a bookshop on Market Street where you could spend hours just reading without anyone bothering you. And in the summer, people would gather in the parks in the evening, and there'd be music and dancing and—" He stopped, the smile fading. "And I left all of it behind to come out here and marry a woman I'd never met." "Why?" May asked. "Why leave all that for a stranger?" "Because in Philadelphia I was nobody, just another clerk in a city full of clerks, working for men who'd never remember my name. The woman, Catherine, her advertisement said she wanted a partner, someone to help build a life, not just serve in someone else's." He laughed bitterly. "I thought I was choosing freedom. Turns out I was choosing a different kind of prison." "You're not in a prison." "Aren't I? I can't go back, can't go forward, can't even make my own choices about where I sleep or what I eat or— He stopped himself, taking a deep breath. "I'm sorry. You didn't ask for my bitterness." "No," May said quietly, "but I understand it." They sat in silence as the rain finally stopped, leaving behind only the sound of water dripping from rocks and the distant cry of a bird testing the air after the storm. When May finally ventured outside, the world had been washed clean. The sky was clearing from the west, revealing patches of blue between the clouds, and the sun broke through in long golden shafts that turned the wet grass into something that sparkled like scattered diamonds. The mare shook herself, spraying water in all directions, and gave May a look that clearly communicated her opinion about being left outside during a storm. "I know," May said, running her hand down the horse's neck. "But you're tougher than him." She nodded toward the shelter where Elias was emerging, blinking in the sudden brightness. They rode through the late afternoon with the clean smell of rain-washed earth in their lungs and the sun warm on their backs. The storm had left the land looking renewed, almost hopeful, and even the mare seemed more energetic, picking up her pace without being urged. As the sun began its descent toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple, May spotted something that made her slow the horse. A farmhouse. It sat alone in a small valley, a modest structure made of logs with a sod roof that had grass growing on it. Smoke rose from the chimney and a small barn stood nearby, along with a chicken coop and what looked like a vegetable garden, now mostly harvested for the season. People, Elias said, and there was something in his voice, relief or hope, or maybe just the desperate need to see other human beings who weren't him or May. Maybe. May studied the property carefully, looking for signs of danger. But everything seemed peaceful, domestic, normal. She guided the mare down into the valley, approaching the farmhouse slowly, giving whoever was inside plenty of time to see them coming and decide whether to be welcoming or hostile. Before they got within 50 yards, the front door opened and a woman stepped out, a rifle cradled in her arms but not pointed at them. She was maybe 40, with graying hair pulled back in a practical bun and a face weathered by sun and wind. "That's close enough," she called out. Her voice was firm but not unfriendly. "State your business." "Looking for a place to camp for the night," May said. "We can pay for the privilege." The woman looked them over carefully. May in her worn trail clothes, Elias in his increasingly disreputable suit, both of them obviously exhausted. "Where you headed?" "North." "That's not much of an answer." "It's the one I've got." The woman's lips twitched, almost smiling. "Fair enough. You running from something or toward something?" "Bit of both, probably. Ain't that always the way?" The woman lowered the rifle slightly. "Name's Martha Kern. This is my farm, such as it is. You're welcome to camp in the barn if you've a mind to. Won't charge you for that, but if you want a hot meal and a chance to clean up, that'll cost you." "How much?" $1 each. That buys you supper, breakfast, and use of the wash house out back." May glanced at Elias, who nodded quickly, his expression eager. "Deal," May said, dismounting. Martha's farm was simple but well-maintained, the kind of place that spoke of hard work and careful management. She showed them where to stable the mare, provided clean water and hay, and then led them to a small building behind the house that served as a wash house. "Water's heated by the stove," Martha explained. "There's soap and towels. Take your time, but don't waste it. I've got supper on and it won't wait forever." She left them alone, and for a moment, May and Elias just stood there, looking at the luxury of a wash basin with actual hot water. "You go first," May said. "Are you sure?" "You need it more than I do." He didn't argue, just nodded gratefully and set about washing away 2 days of trail dust and dried sweat. When he emerged from behind the privacy screen, his hair wet and his face clean, he looked like a different person, younger, less haunted, almost hopeful. "Your turn," he said. May took her time, letting the hot water work out some of the stiffness in her muscles and wash away the grime that had accumulated. When she was done, she felt almost human again. Supper was waiting for them in Martha's kitchen. Rabbit stew with carrots and potatoes, fresh bread that was still warm from the oven, and coffee that actually tasted like coffee instead of burned dirt. They ate in silence for the first few minutes, too hungry to bother with conversation. Martha watched them with the quiet amusement of someone who'd seen many hungry travelers and understood that food came before words. "So," she said eventually, refilling their coffee cups, "what's your story?" "We don't have one," May said. "Everyone's got a story, honey. Question is whether you're willing to share it." Elias looked at May, uncertain. She gave him the smallest shake of her head. Not quite no, but definitely proceed with caution. "We're traveling together," Elias said carefully. "Heading north to start over." "Married?" Martha asked, her eyes moving between them. "No," they said simultaneously, perhaps too quickly. Martha's eyebrows rose. "None of my business, I suppose. Though I'll say this, out here, people make assumptions about a man and woman traveling alone together. Might be easier on both of you if you had a story that made sense to folks who ask." "We'll keep that in mind," May said. Martha nodded and let the subject drop, steering the conversation instead towards safer topics: the weather, the coming winter, The difficulty of farming in territory this remote. When they finished eating, Martha showed them to the barn where they'd be sleeping. She'd laid out fresh straw and provided blankets that smelled of lavender and sunshine. "You need anything else? House is right there," she said, pointing. "Sleep well." After she left, May and Elias arranged their bedrolls on opposite sides of the barn, maintaining a careful distance. "She's kind," Elias said quietly. "Martha." "She's practical," May corrected. $2 for food and shelter that didn't cost her much to provide. "That's not kindness, that's business." "Can it be both?" May didn't answer. They lay down in the darkness, listening to the small sounds of the barn, the mare shifting in her stall, the rustle of mice in the hay, the creak of wood settling. "May?" Elias's voice was soft, uncertain. "What?" "Thank you for today, for not leaving me behind when I slowed you down." She was quiet for so long he probably thought she'd fallen asleep, but finally she spoke, her voice barely audible. "Go to sleep, Elias. Not you're welcome, not don't mention it, just go to sleep." But somehow, in the darkness of Martha Kern's barn, it felt like enough. Morning arrived with the smell of fresh coffee and frying bacon drifting through the barn walls, pulling May from sleep before the sun had fully cleared the horizon. She woke to find Elias already up, standing near the barn door, with his arms wrapped around himself against the morning chill, watching the sky turn from gray to gold. "You're up early," she said, rolling to her feet and folding her blanket with practiced efficiency. "Couldn't sleep much." He turned to look at her, and in the early light she could see dark circles under his eyes. "Kept thinking about what Martha said last night, about people making assumptions. People always make assumptions, that's what people do. But she had a point, didn't she, about us needing a story that makes sense." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "We can't just keep saying we're traveling together. Eventually someone's going to ask questions we can't answer." May pulled on her boots and checked her knife, making sure it was still secure at her belt. "So what do you suggest? We could tell people we're married." She looked at him sharply. "We're not." "I know that, but it would explain why we're traveling alone together. Why you're—" He gestured vaguely at her, at the situation, at everything that didn't fit into normal frontier expectations. "Why you're protecting me instead of just leaving me somewhere." "I'm not protecting you." "Aren't you?" There was no challenge in his voice, just quiet observation. "You could have left me in Broken Creek, could have abandoned me during the storm, could have told Martha I was just cargo you were hauling north, but you didn't." May was quiet for a long moment, her jaw tight. "The contract says you're mine. That's all." "The contract says a lot of things that don't seem to matter much to you." Before she could respond, the barn door swung open and Martha appeared, carrying a basket covered with a cloth. "Figured you two might want to eat out here instead of coming up to the house. Saved you the walk." She set the basket down on a hay bale and pulled back the cloth, revealing biscuits, bacon, and a jar of what looked like preserves. "Coffee's in the pot there, cups too." "You didn't have to do this," Elias said. "Didn't have to, wanted to." Martha studied them both with the sharp eyes of a woman who'd learned to read people the way others read books. "You two remind me of someone, my daughter and her husband, back when they first got together, all stiff and uncertain around each other, like neither one knew quite what to do with the other." "We're not," May started. "I know what you're not," Martha interrupted gently. "Just saying what you remind me of. Now eat up before it gets cold, and when you're done, if you've got time before you head out, I could use a hand with something." She left before either of them could refuse, the barn door swinging shut behind her. They ate in silence, the food warm and good, and worlds better than the trail rations they'd been surviving on. When they finished, May stood and brushed crumbs from her lap. "We should help her. We owe her that much." Agreed. They found Martha behind the house, standing next to a fence that had clearly seen better days. Several posts were leaning at dangerous angles, and one section of rail had fallen completely. "Storm last night did some damage," Martha explained. "I can fix it myself, but it'll take me all day. With help, maybe we can get it done in a few hours." "We can help," Elias said immediately. Martha looked at him with barely concealed amusement. "You know anything about fence repair, city boy?" His face flushed. "No, ma'am, but I can follow instructions. That's good enough for me. She handed him a hammer. Let's get to work. For the next 3 hours, they labored under Martha's patient direction. May discovered that Elias might not know anything about fence repair, but he was willing to learn and strong enough to be useful once he understood what needed doing. He dug post holes without complaint, even when the rocky soil made every shovelful a battle. He held rails steady while May hammered them into place, his hands never wavering even when the vibrations must have hurt. Martha watched them work with approving eyes, occasionally offering guidance, but mostly letting them figure things out themselves. "You're good with your hands," she said to May at one point. "Both of you are, in different ways. Him with the steady holding, you with the striking true." She paused meaningfully. "Makes me think you two might actually make something work, given time." "We're just fixing a fence," May said. "Sure you are, honey, sure you are." By noon, the fence stood solid and straight, ready to withstand whatever the next storm brought. Martha insisted they come inside for a proper midday meal before they left, and this time there was no polite way to refuse. Over plates of cold chicken and fresh-baked bread, Martha told them about her life on the farm, about the husband she'd lost to pneumonia 5 years back, the daughter who'd married a rancher and moved 3 days' ride south, the loneliness of running a place this size alone. "Don't you ever think about leaving?" Elias asked. "Moving closer to your daughter, maybe?" "Every winter," Martha admitted. "When the snow gets deep and the wind howls, and I'm alone in that house wondering if this is the night the roof finally gives in." She smiled sadly. "But come spring, when the grass turns green and the calves are born and everything feels possible again, I remember why I stay. This land gets in your blood, you know. Hard to leave once it does." May understood that in a way Elias probably couldn't. The land did get in your blood out here, but so did the violence, the loneliness, the constant edge of survival that made everything else feel pale and insignificant by comparison. When they finally prepared to leave, Martha walked them out to the barn and watched as May saddled the mare. "You take care of each other," she said. "Both of you." "We will," Elias promised. Martha turned to May. "And you let him help you sometime. I see the way you do everything yourself, like accepting help means weakness. It doesn't. Sometimes the strongest thing you can do is let someone else carry part of the load." May didn't know how to respond to that, so she just nodded and swung up into the saddle. As Elias settled in behind her and they rode out of the valley, he said quietly, "She was right, you know." "About what?" "About letting people help. You don't have to do everything alone. I've survived this long by not relying on anyone else." "Survived, yes, but is that the same as living?" She didn't answer, just kicked the mare into a faster pace that made conversation difficult. They rode hard through the afternoon, putting distance between themselves and Martha's farm, between themselves and Broken Creek, between themselves and everything that had happened in the past few days. The land opened up ahead of them, vast and empty and beautiful in its indifference. As the sun began to sink toward the western horizon, painting the clouds in shades of crimson and gold, May spotted something that made her rein in the mare. Riders. 3 of them, maybe 2 miles distant, following roughly the same path they'd been traveling. "What is it?" Elias asked, feeling her tense. "Company. Maybe nothing. Maybe trouble." "How can you tell from this far away?" "Can't. That's the problem." She studied the riders for a long moment, watching the way they moved, the purposeful pace that suggested they weren't just drifting. "We need to get off the main trail. Now." She guided the mare east, away from the clear path they'd been following, into rougher country where rocks and scrub brush would hide their tracks. Behind them, the sun continued its descent, and the riders kept coming. By the time full darkness fell, May had led them deep into a maze of broken ground and scattered boulders. She found a spot tucked between 2 large rocks where they could see anyone approaching but would be difficult to spot themselves. "No fire tonight," she said, dismounting, "and we stay quiet." Elias nodded, his face pale in the dimming light. "You think they're following us?" "Don't know, but I didn't live this long by assuming the best about strangers on my trail." They sat in the darkness, listening to the night sounds. The wind through rocks, the distant cry of a coyote, the mare's occasional huff as she shifted her weight. Time stretched out, measured in heartbeats, and held breath. Then faint but unmistakable, the sound of horses moving through the night. May's hand went to her knife. Beside her, she felt Elias freeze, barely breathing. The sound grew louder, closer. 3 riders moving slowly, cautiously, like they were searching for something in the darkness. "Spread out," a voice called, rough and commanding. "They can't have gone far. Ground's too hard here to hide tracks completely." May recognized that voice. Dooley, the ranch hand from the poker game who'd accused her of cheating. "This is stupid, Dooley," another voice said. "We don't even know if they came this way. Pike said they were headed north. This is north, ain't it?" "North covers a lot of territory. Just search. Pike's paying good money to get his property back, and I aim to collect." Property. They were talking about Elias like he was a runaway horse. May felt Elias's hand find hers in the darkness, his grip tight with fear. She squeezed back once. Not comfort, exactly, but acknowledgement. "We're in this together," the gesture said. "At least for now." The riders moved closer, their horses picking their way through the rocks. One of them passed within 50 feet of their hiding spot, close enough that May could hear the creak of saddle leather and smell tobacco smoke. Then, slowly, the sounds began to recede. The riders moved past their position, continuing north, their voices fading into the distance until there was nothing but silence and darkness again. They waited another hour before May finally relaxed her grip on the knife. "They'll be back," she said quietly. "Once they realize they've lost the trail, they'll backtrack and search more carefully." "What do we do?" "We leave before dawn. Move fast and keep moving until we're somewhere they won't think to look." "Where?" May thought about that. They needed somewhere remote, somewhere a woman and a man traveling together wouldn't draw attention, somewhere Pike's men wouldn't think to search. "I know a place," she said finally. "It's rough country, and the people there don't ask questions, but it's 3 days' hard ride from here, maybe more. Can we make it?" "We'll have to." They didn't sleep that night, both of them too keyed up from the close call. Instead, they sat in the darkness and talked in whispers, their voices barely audible over the wind. "Tell me about the place we're going," Elias said. "It's called Redemption, a mining town that went bust about 5 years back. Most people left, but a few stayed, the ones who had nowhere else to go or nothing else to lose. It's not pretty and it's not safe, but it's off the main routes. Pike's men won't look for us there." "You've been there before?" "Once. Long time ago." She paused. "I killed a man there." She felt him stiffen beside her. "What?" "He tried to rob me. I defended myself." The people there understood. They live by their own rules. As long as you don't cause trouble for them, they don't cause trouble for you. "Is that what I am to you?" Elias asked quietly. "Trouble?" May was silent for a long moment. "I don't know what you are yet. But you're still protecting me." "I'm protecting the choice I made when I won that card game. There's a difference." "Is there?" Before she could answer, the first gray light of dawn began to creep across the eastern sky, turning the world from black to charcoal to smoke. "Time to move," May said, standing and brushing dust from her pants. "We've got a long ride ahead." They rode through the dawn and into the morning, pushing the mare harder than May liked, but not hard enough to break her. Behind them, the sun climbed higher, and ahead, the land grew rougher. More rocks, fewer trees, everything seeming to warn travelers to turn back while they still could. Around midday, they stopped briefly at a creek to water the horse and refill their canteens. While the mare drank, Elias splashed water on his face and neck, trying to wash away some of the dust and exhaustion. "Can I ask you something?" he said. "You're going to anyway. Why did you really take the contract? And don't tell me it's because you made a choice. There has to be more to it than that." May was quiet for so long he probably thought she wouldn't answer. But finally she spoke, her voice barely audible over the sound of running water. "When I was 16, my father sold me to pay a gambling debt." Elias went very still. "Man who bought me was a railroad foreman. Figured he'd get a wife and a housekeeper and whatever else he wanted, all for the price of my father's markers." She stared at the water, seeing something else entirely. "I lasted 3 months. Then I killed him and ran." "The man you killed in Redemption," Elias said slowly. "Was he—" "No, different man, different reason. But the principle was the same. Someone thought they could own me, and I proved them wrong." She looked at him directly. "When Pike put you up as a bet, when he treated you like property to be traded. I saw my father, and I decided right then that you weren't going to end up like I did. So you do care what happens to me. I care about proving that people aren't property. What happens to you specifically?" She trailed off. "We'll figure that out when we get to redemption." They rode on through the afternoon, the landscape growing increasingly hostile. The grass gave way to bare rock and scattered sage, and the few trees they passed were twisted and stunted, shaped by winds that never stopped blowing. As the sun began its descent toward evening, Elias said, "I've been thinking about what you said, about your father. Don't. Just listen. I'm trying to understand something." He paused, gathering his thoughts. "In Philadelphia, I thought I understood what freedom meant. I had a job, a room, money in my pocket. I could walk where I wanted, buy what I needed. That felt like freedom. But I was still just a cog in someone else's machine, still dependent on men who could fire me on a whim, still stuck in a system I had no power to change. Coming west was supposed to fix that, supposed to give me actual control over my own life." He laughed bitterly. "Instead, I ended up being traded like livestock, lost even the illusion of freedom. And now? Now I don't know. You say you don't own me, but I'm completely dependent on you for survival. Is that freedom, or just a different kind of cage?" May thought about that as the mare picked her way through a field of broken stone. Maybe freedom isn't about not depending on anyone. Maybe it's about choosing who you depend on and why. Is that what we're doing? Choosing? You chose to come with me instead of staying in that freight office. I chose to bring you instead of leaving you for Pike's creditors. So yes, we're choosing, even though neither of us had good options. Especially then. Freedom isn't about having perfect choices. It's about making the best choice you can with what you've got. As darkness fell, they made camp in the lee of a massive boulder that blocked the worst of the wind. May allowed a small fire. They were far enough from any pursuit now that the risk seemed acceptable, and the temperature was dropping fast. Over a dinner of beans and hardtack softened in the bean water, Elias said, "Thank you for telling me about your father. I know that wasn't easy. It's just history. It's more than that. It's trust. And He hesitated. "I want you to know I won't betray that trust. Whatever happens when we get to redemption, whatever you decide to do about the contract, I won't use what you told me against you." Wasn't worried about that. Weren't you? Even a little? May looked at him across the small fire, his face half lit by the flickering flames, and realized with some surprise that she hadn't been worried. Somewhere in the past few days she'd started to trust him. Not completely, not with everything, but with enough that she'd shared something she'd never told another living soul. "Get some sleep," she said instead of answering. "Tomorrow's going to be harder than today." That seems to be true of every tomorrow out here. Welcome to the frontier. That night, May dreamed of poker tables and contracts written in blood, of men who thought people were property, and fathers who sold daughters like cattle. She woke once in the darkest part of night to find Elias awake too, sitting with his back against the boulder and his arms wrapped around his knees, staring at the dying embers of their fire. "Can't sleep?" she asked, thinking about redemption. "About what happens when we get there. What do you want to happen?" He was quiet for so long she thought he wouldn't answer. Then, "I want to be useful. I want to matter. I want to be something other than a burden or a prize or a debt." He looked at her. "Is that possible?" "I don't know," she said honestly, "but we'll find out together." On the third day after leaving Martha's farm, they finally saw redemption in the distance. It sat in a valley between two rocky hills, a collection of weathered buildings that had once housed hundreds of miners and now barely sheltered a few dozen stubborn souls who refused to admit the dream was dead. Even from a distance, May could see the abandoned mine works on the hillside, the rusted equipment scattered like bones, the empty shells of buildings with their windows like hollow eyes staring at nothing. "This is it?" Elias asked, his voice uncertain. "This is it. It looks like it died and nobody bothered to bury it." "That's about right." May guided the mare down the slope toward the town. "But the people who are still here, they're survivors. They'll leave us alone as long as we return the favor." As they rode into what passed for the main street, a few faces appeared in windows and doorways, watching, evaluating, deciding whether these newcomers were worth acknowledging. Most turned away after a moment, their curiosity satisfied. May headed straight for the largest building still standing, a two-story structure that had probably been a hotel once and now served as a boarding house, saloon, and general gathering place for whoever was still stubborn enough to call Redemption home. She dismounted and tied the mare to the hitching post, then turned to help Elias down. His legs nearly buckled when his feet hit the ground, and she had to steady him with a hand on his arm. 3 days hard riding, she said. You did better than I expected. That's the nicest thing you've ever said to me. Don't let it go to your head. They walked into the building together, and for the first time since leaving Broken Creek, May felt like they might actually have found a place where they could breathe without looking over their shoulders. At least for a while. The interior of the building smelled like old wood, stale beer, and the accumulated resignation of people who'd given up on dreams but hadn't quite given up on breathing. A handful of patrons sat scattered around tables that had seen better decades, nursing drinks and conversations that moved with the speed of winter molasses. Behind a makeshift bar constructed from salvaged mine timbers, a broad-shouldered woman with iron-gray hair looked up from the glass she was wiping. Her eyes, sharp and assessing, took in May and Elias in a single sweep, cataloging everything from the trail dust on their clothes to the way Elias stood slightly behind May, like he wasn't quite sure of his welcome. "May Crow," the woman said, her voice like gravel rolling downhill. "Heard you were dead." "Heard the same about you, Abigail." The corner of Abigail's mouth twitched in what might have been a smile on someone less weathered. "Turns out we're both disappointingly alive." "You looking for a room or just passing through?" "Room. 2 if you have them, 1 if you don't." Abigail's eyes flicked to Elias, then back to May. 1 room, 2 beds. That work?" "It works." $5 a week. That includes breakfast and 1 hot meal a day. Water for washing costs extra, and you haul it yourself from the pump out back. She set down the glass and pulled a ledger from beneath the bar. "How long you planning to stay?" "Don't know yet." "Fair enough. Most people who end up here don't plan much beyond tomorrow anyway." Abigail opened the ledger and dipped a pen in ink. "Names?" "May Crow and—" May paused, realizing she'd never actually introduced Elias to anyone by name except Martha. "Elias Ward." Abigail wrote their names in careful script, then looked up at Elias. "You got business in Redemption, Mr. Ward? Or are you just following wherever she leads?" Elias straightened slightly, something defensive in his posture. "I'm with her." "That doesn't answer my question." "It's the only answer you're getting," May said quietly. Abigail studied them both for a long moment, then shrugged. "None of my concern anyway. Rooms upstairs, second door on the right, keys in the lock. You break anything, you pay for it. You cause trouble, you leave. We clear?" "Clear." "Good. Supper's at 6. Don't be late. What's cooked is cooked, and I don't hold plates for anyone." May paid for the first week from her dwindling supply of winnings and led Elias up a narrow staircase that creaked under their weight. The second-floor hallway was dim and smelled faintly of mildew, but the room itself was better than she'd expected. 2 narrow beds with reasonably clean blankets, a washstand with a chipped basin, and a window that actually had glass in it. Elias sat down heavily on the bed nearest the door, his shoulders sagging with exhaustion. "We made it. For now." May set her saddlebag on the other bed and moved to the window, checking the view. It overlooked the main street, which meant she could see anyone coming or going. Good for surveillance, bad for privacy. She'd take the former over the latter any day. "What happens now?" Elias asked. "Now we rest. Tomorrow we figure out what comes next." "That's not much of a plan." "It's the only one I've got." She turned from the window to face him. "You did well these past few days. Better than I expected for someone who'd never been more than a day's walk from Philadelphia." "Is that your version of a compliment? Take it however you want." He was quiet for a moment, then said, "Back there, with Abigail. You could have told her I was hired help or a traveling companion or anything that wouldn't make people think we're—" He trailed off. "Together?" "Yes." "Would you rather I had?" "I don't know." He rubbed his face with both hands, exhaustion making him blunt. "I don't know what we are. I don't know what I'm supposed to be. I don't know anything except that 3 weeks ago I was a clerk in Philadelphia with a plan for my life, and now I'm in a dead mining town with a woman who won me in a poker game, and I have no idea what tomorrow looks like. May sat down on her own bed, facing him across the narrow space between them. You want certainty. I understand that, but out here certainty's a luxury nobody can afford. So what do? You survive today. Then tomorrow, you survive tomorrow. And you keep doing that until eventually you're not just surviving anymore. You're living. And that's enough for you? Just surviving? She thought about that question, really thought about it, and realized she didn't have a good answer. Survival had been her entire focus for so long that she'd forgotten there might be something beyond it. It used to be, she said finally. Before Elias could respond, voices erupted from downstairs, loud, angry, the kind of commotion that meant trouble was brewing. May was on her feet instantly, her hand moving to the knife at her belt. Stay here, she said. Like hell I will. She turned to look at him, surprised. This doesn't concern you. If it concerns you, it concerns me. He stood up, his jaw set with determination that looked almost convincing on his city soft face. We're in this together, remember? You said so yourself. She wanted to argue, wanted to order him to stay put where he'd be safe, but the look in his eyes stopped her. He'd made his choice, just like she'd made hers back in that saloon in Broken Creek. Fine, but you stay behind me, and if I tell you to run, you run. Understood? Understood. They descended the stairs together to find Abigail facing down 3 men who'd clearly ridden hard and recently. Their clothes were dust-covered, their faces wind-burned, and they had the dangerous energy of people who'd come looking for something specific. Dooley stood in the center, flanked by the 2 men who'd been with him that night in the rocks. His eyes swept the room, looking for something, and when they landed on May, his face split into a smile that held no warmth whatsoever. Well, told the boys we'd find you eventually. He took a step forward, his hand resting on the gun at his hip. You led us on quite a chase, Miss Crow. May positioned herself between Dooley and the stairs, forcing Elias to stay behind her. This is a private establishment. You got business here, or are you just passing through? Our business is with you, or more specifically, with the property you stole from Harlan Pike. I didn't steal anything. I won it fair and square. That's not how Pike sees it, and that's not how his creditors see it either. Man was supposed to deliver a worker to settle his debts, and when he couldn't deliver, Dooley shrugged. Well, let's just say there's people who are very interested in getting their property back. He's not property, Elias said from behind May, his voice carrying more clearly than she'd expected. And I'm not going with you. Dooley's eyes shifted to Elias and his smile widened. There he is, the famous mail-order husband who's caused so much trouble. You know how much Pike's creditors are offering for your return? $50? Dead or alive, though they'd prefer alive, more work they can get out of you that way. May's hand tightened on her knife. You're not taking him. You planning to stop all 3 of us with that pig sticker? Dooley gestured at her knife. We're all armed, Miss Crow, and while I respect your skill at cards, I doubt you're fast enough to take us all before one of us puts a bullet in you. Maybe not. Abigail's voice cut through the tension like a blade through silk. She'd moved to the end of the bar, and in her hands was a double-barreled shotgun that looked older than the town itself, but no less deadly for its age. But between her knife and my scattergun, I'd say the odds just got a lot more interesting. Dooley's smile faltered. This doesn't concern you, Abigail. Hell, it doesn't. This is my establishment, and I don't take kindly to armed men threatening my paying customers. She raised the shotgun slightly, not quite pointing it at anyone, but making her intentions clear. Now you can leave peaceful, or you can leave in pieces. Your choice. For a long moment, nobody moved. The other patrons in the room had gone very still, the kind of stillness that came from extensive experience with frontier violence and a strong desire not to be caught in the crossfire. Then one of Dooley's companions, a thin man with nervous eyes, said quietly, Dooley, maybe we should— Shut up, Harv. Dooley's hand moved fractionally closer to his gun. We rode 3 days to get here. We're not leaving empty-handed. You're not leaving with him, May said flatly. That's not negotiable. Everything's negotiable. Question is what you're willing to trade. I'm not trading anything. Dooley's expression hardened. Then I guess we got a problem. The room held its breath, waiting for someone to make the move that would turn words into violence. May could feel her heartbeat in her throat, could sense Elias's presence behind her, could hear Abigail's breathing as she kept the shotgun steady. Then Elias stepped out from behind May, moving before she could stop him. "Wait," he said, his voice surprisingly calm. "Before anyone does something stupid, let me ask you a question, Dooley. How much is Pike actually paying you for this?" Dooley blinked, thrown by the unexpected question. "What? How much?" "He's offering $50 to his creditors for my return, but how much of that are you actually seeing? 10? 20? Or is he just promising you a cut once his debts are settled? That's none of your concern. It should be yours, though, because you're risking your life for a man who's already proven he can't pay his debts. What makes you think he'll pay you?" Elias took another step forward, and May had to fight the urge to drag him back to safety. "You rode 3 days, probably spent money on supplies and lodging, risked running into Abigail's shotgun, and for what? A promise from a man who gambles away everything he owns?" "He's right," Harv said quietly. "Pike still owes me for that horse I sold him last year." "Shut up, Harv," Dooley snapped, but there was less conviction in his voice now. "I'm just saying, maybe we should think about—" "I said shut up!" Elias pressed his advantage. "I'll make you a better offer. Ride back to Broken Creek. Tell Pike you couldn't find us. Tell his creditors the same thing. And I'll pay you $20 right now, 10 for you, 5 each for your friends. That's more than you'll probably see from Pike, and you don't have to risk getting shot to collect it." "Where would you get $20? Dooley demanded. "You came here with nothing." "I have it," May said quietly. She did, barely. It would take most of what remained from her poker winnings, but if it avoided bloodshed, it might be worth it. Dooley looked between them, his hand still hovering near his gun, uncertainty written across his face. "This is a trick." "It's not a trick, it's business." Elias held out his hand. "Shake on it, and I'll get you the money right now." "Dooley," the third man said, a burly fellow who'd been silent until now. "My horse threw a shoe 2 days back. I need money for a new one, not promises from Pike's creditors." Dooley stood there, jaw clenched, pride warring with practicality. Finally, he lowered his hand from his gun. $20, cash, right now." "May," Elias looked at her. She wanted to refuse on principle, wanted to tell Dooley to go to hell and let the cards fall where they may. But she saw the tension in Abigail's shoulders, the nervous energy of the other patrons, and knew that if this turned violent, innocent people might die alongside the guilty. "Upstairs," she said. "Money's in my room." She climbed the stairs with all 3 men watching her back, acutely aware of how vulnerable she was turning away from them. But Abigail kept the shotgun trained on Dooley, and that was insurance enough. In the room, she counted out $20 from her dwindling stash, each coin feeling like a piece of her freedom being traded away. But when she came back downstairs and dropped the money into Dooley's outstretched hand, the relief on Elias's face made it almost worthwhile. "Pleasure doing business," Dooley said, pocketing the coins. "But this doesn't change anything long term. Pike's creditors won't stop looking just because we did." "Let them look," May said. "They won't find us." Dooley laughed, short and bitter. "You really think you can hide forever in a place like this? Redemption's dying, Miss Crow. Give it another year and there won't be anything left but ghosts and bad memories. Where are you going to run then?" "That's tomorrow's problem. Suit yourself." He nodded to his companions. "Come on, let's get out of this graveyard before we end up buried in it." The 3 men filed out, their spurs jingling on the wooden floor. Through the window, May watched them mount up and ride out the way they'd come, heading south toward whatever waited for them in Broken Creek. Only when they were out of sight did Abigail finally lower the shotgun. "That was interesting," she said mildly. "Your friend there has a silver tongue when he needs it." "He's not my friend," May said automatically. "No? Could have fooled me, the way you were ready to bleed for him." May turned to Elias, who was still standing in the middle of the room looking slightly dazed, like he couldn't quite believe what he'd just done. "You shouldn't have stepped out like that. They could have shot you." "But they didn't. That's not the point." "Isn't it?" He met her eyes. "You were ready to fight 3 armed men to protect me. Seemed like the least I could do was try talking first. Talking doesn't always work. Neither does fighting. But today, talking saved us $20 and probably several lives." He paused. I'm not completely useless, May. I can't shoot, and I can't fight, but I can think. And sometimes that's enough. Abigail set the shotgun back under the bar with a heavy thunk. He's right, you know. Smart beats strong more often than folks like to admit. She looked at May. You did good picking him. I didn't pick him. I won him in a card game. Sure you did, honey. Sure you did. Abigail turned back to her work, clearly done with the conversation. Supper's still at 6. Don't be late. Back upstairs, May counted what remained of her money. $32. Not nothing, but not enough to last more than a few weeks if they had to keep paying for room and board. I'm sorry, Elias said quietly. About the money. I didn't mean to. You did what needed doing. Can't fault you for that. But now we're running low on funds, and I can't contribute anything because I don't have any skills that... You talked 3 armed men into leaving without bloodshed. That's a skill. She put the money away and sat down on her bed, suddenly exhausted. And you were right about what you said downstairs. You're not useless. He looked at her, surprise evident on his face. That might be the second compliment you've ever given me. Don't get used to it. Wouldn't dream of it. He sat down on his own bed, mirroring her position. What do we do now? About money, I mean. We can't live on $32 forever. No, we'll need to find work. What kind of work? May thought about that. She had skills, but most of them weren't the kind you could advertise openly. She could track, could hunt, could survive in conditions that would kill softer people. But Redemption was a dying town. There wasn't much call for tracking or hunting when everybody was just trying to hold on to what little they had left. I'll figure something out, she said. We'll figure something out, Elias corrected. You keep saying we're in this together, but you still talk like you're alone. Old habits. Maybe it's time for new ones. Before she could respond, there was a knock at the door, sharp, authoritative. May's hand went to her knife as she stood and moved to answer it. Abigail stood in the hallway, her expression serious. Got someone downstairs wants to talk to you. Says it's about work. What kind of work? The kind that pays. You interested or not? May glanced back at Elias, who nodded. We're interested. The man waiting for them downstairs was older, maybe 60, with a face like weathered saddle leather and hands that had clearly spent decades doing hard labor. He sat alone at a corner table, a cup of coffee cooling in front of him. Maycrow? He asked as they approached. That's me. Name's Jacob Reeves. I run the only working mine left in these hills. Small operation, just me and my 2 sons and a couple hired hands. We pull enough silver out to make it worth the effort, but barely. He gestured to the empty chairs. Sit, please. They sat, and May waited. She'd learned long ago that the person who spoke first in a negotiation usually lost ground. I hear you're good with a gun, Reeves said finally. I'm adequate. That's not what I heard. Abigail says you've survived things that would have killed most people twice over. Says you're smart, careful, and you don't panic. He paused. That sound about right? Close enough? Good. Because I've got a problem, and I think you might be the solution. He leaned forward, his voice dropping. Someone's been stealing from my mine, not the ore. That'd be too obvious. But supplies, tools, things that are expensive to replace and essential to keep the operation running. You think it's one of your workers? I know it's not. I trust my sons, and the hired hands have been with me for years. This is someone from outside, someone who knows the mine schedule, knows when we're all underground and can't see what's happening on the surface. Why not go to the law? Reeves laughed bitterly. What law? Nearest marshal's 3 days' ride south, and he's got no interest in a dying mining town's petty theft problems. We're on our own out here, Miss Crow. Always have been. And you want me to do what exactly? Catch the thief. Or at minimum, scare them off so they stop stealing from me. He named a figure that made May's eyebrows rise. $50 if you solve my problem. $25 up front, $25 when it's done. She looked at Elias, who gave a tiny nod. I'll need details, she said. When the thefts happen, what's being taken, anything you've noticed that seems off. I can give you all that, but there's one condition. Which is? You work alone. I don't need a crowd tramping around my mine, scaring off whoever's doing this. His eyes flicked to Elias. No offense to your companion. He comes with me or I don't take the job. Reeves frowned. Why? He doesn't look like he'd be much use in a situation that might turn violent. Maybe not, Elias said quietly. But I can watch. I can listen. And I can think. Sometimes that's more useful than knowing which end of a gun to point. Reeves studied him for a long moment, then shrugged. Fine. But if he gets in the way or gets hurt, that's on you, not me. Understood. They spent the next hour going over details. The thefts had started about 2 months ago, always during the day when Reeves and his crew were underground. Mostly tools at first, picks, shovels, lanterns, but recently someone had taken a whole crate of dynamite, which was both expensive and dangerous in the wrong hands. That's when I knew I needed help, Reeves said. A thief I can tolerate, so someone stealing explosives? That's something else entirely. You think they're planning to use it? I think anyone stealing dynamite has plans, and those plans probably aren't good for anyone involved. When Reeves finally left, pressing $25 into May's hand as promised, Elias said, "This could be dangerous." Most things worth doing are. I'm serious. Whoever's stealing from Reeves might be desperate enough to kill if they're caught. I know. And you're still taking the job. We need the money, and... She paused, surprised by her own honesty. And it feels good to be useful again, to have a purpose beyond just surviving. Elias smiled slightly. See? You're learning to live, not just survive. Don't get philosophical on me. Too late. That night, over Abigail's supper of venison stew and cornbread, they planned their approach. Reeves's mine was about 3 miles north of town, set into a hillside that had once yielded enough silver to make a dozen men rich. Now it barely produced enough to keep one family fed, but Reeves was stubborn, or desperate, enough to keep working it. We'll need to watch the mine during the day, May said quietly, speaking low enough that the other diners couldn't overhear. See who comes and goes, look for patterns. And at night? At night we rest and plan the next day's watch. This could take a while. Whoever's doing this is smart enough to have avoided getting caught for 2 months. What if they don't show up while we're watching? Then we try something else. Set a trap, maybe. Leave something valuable where they can see it and wait for them to make a move. Elias nodded slowly. In Philadelphia, we had problems with theft at the firm sometimes. The owner's solution was to hire guards and put locks on everything. And did it work? Not really. People who wanted to steal found ways around the guards and the locks. What finally worked was figuring out why they were stealing in the first place. You think this is about need, not greed? Out here? In a town that's dying? Probably. He paused. Doesn't make it right, but it might make it understandable. They finished their meal in companionable silence, and as they climbed the stairs to their room, May found herself thinking about how much had changed in just a few days. She'd gone from solitary survival to shared purpose, from trusting no one to trusting at least one person enough to sleep in the same room, from seeing Elias as an inconvenient prize to seeing him as something closer to a partner. She still didn't know what that meant exactly, still didn't know where this was all heading or how it would end. But for the first time in longer than she could remember, she was curious enough about the future to actually want to see it. They left for Reeves's mine before dawn, the sky still dark and studded with stars that would fade as the sun climbed. May had packed supplies for a long day of watching: water, dried meat, the last of Abigail's cornbread wrapped in cloth. Elias carried a blanket and a small notebook he'd purchased from the general store with his own carefully hoarded coins, insisting that if they were going to watch for patterns, someone should write them down. The mine sat exactly where Reeves had described, carved into a hillside that overlooked a narrow valley. The entrance was shored up with timber that looked newer than the rest of the operation, and various pieces of equipment lay scattered around: ore carts on rusted rails, a hand-cranked winch, coils of rope, and stacks of supplies covered with tarps. There, May said, pointing to a rocky outcrop about 200 yards from the mine entrance. We can see the whole operation from up there without being seen ourselves. They climbed to the outcrop and settled in just as the first gray light of dawn began washing across the valley. From their vantage point, they could see not just the mine, but also the road leading to it and most of the surrounding terrain. Now we wait, May said. Waiting, it turned out, was something Elias was surprisingly good at. He didn't fidget, didn't complain about the hard rock beneath them or the cold morning air. He just sat quietly, watching, occasionally making notes in his little book when something caught his attention. Around 8 o'clock, Reeves and his 2 sons arrived. 3 men who looked so similar they could only be family. They checked the supplies, discussed something May couldn't hear from this distance, and then disappeared into the mine entrance carrying picks and lanterns. "That's our window," Elias said quietly. "Whenever they're underground is when the thief strikes." So we watch. They watched. Hours passed. The sun climbed higher, turning the morning chill into afternoon heat. Nothing moved except the occasional bird, and once, a coyote that trotted past the mine entrance without showing any interest in human affairs. "This could take days," Elias said eventually. "Probably will. And if they don't come while we're watching, then we come back tomorrow and the day after that until they do." He was quiet for a moment, then said, "In Philadelphia, I once spent 3 weeks tracking a discrepancy in the company ledgers. 3 weeks of checking every entry, every number, looking for the mistake. My supervisor thought I was wasting time, said it was probably just a clerical error that didn't matter." "Was it?" "No. It was deliberate theft. One of the senior clerks had been skimming for months, hiding it in the columns where he thought no one would look." Elias smiled slightly. "Point is, I know patience. I know how to wait for something to reveal itself." "Good, because—" May stopped, her body going tense. "Someone's coming." A figure appeared on the road from town, moving quickly but cautiously. From this distance, May couldn't make out much detail. Average height, wearing a long coat despite the heat, hat pulled low. The figure approached the mine, looked around carefully, then moved to one of the tarped supply piles. They worked quickly, efficiently, loading something into a sack they'd brought. "Should we go down there?" Elias whispered. "Not yet. Let's see what they take and where they go." They watched as the figure filled their sack, checked the mine entrance once more, and then headed not back toward town but east, into the rougher country beyond the valley. "Come on," May said, already moving. "We follow, but keep our distance." They descended from the outcrop and began tracking the thief, using the rocks and scrub brush for cover. May moved like water, silent and fluid, while Elias did his best to imitate her, stepping where she stepped and freezing when she froze. The thief led them almost 2 miles into increasingly rough terrain, before finally stopping at what looked like an old prospector's cabin, half collapsed and forgotten. They disappeared inside, and May signaled Elias to stop. "Wait here," she whispered. "No, we do this together." "Elias, together." That was the deal. She wanted to argue, but the determination in his eyes stopped her. Instead, she nodded and they approached the cabin together, moving carefully around to where they could peer through a gap in the weathered boards. Inside, the thief was unpacking their haul, tools mostly, along with what looked like rope and some canned goods. And sitting on a makeshift bed in the corner, watching with wide, frightened eyes, was a child. A girl, maybe 10 years old, thin as a rail, and wrapped in a blanket that had seen better years. The thief, and May could see now it was a woman, maybe 30, with a gaunt face and desperate eyes, knelt beside the child and spoke in tones too low to hear, but the gesture was unmistakable. Comfort, care, protection. May felt something shift in her chest, a recognition she didn't want to acknowledge. "She's not stealing for profit," Elias breathed. "She's stealing to survive." "We don't know that for sure." "Look at them, May. Look at that child. When's the last time she had a proper meal?" Before May could respond, the woman inside suddenly stood and reached for something. A gun, old and probably unreliable, but deadly enough at close range. "I know you're out there," the woman called, her voice shaking. "I heard you coming. You want to take me in? Fine, but you leave my daughter alone. She hasn't done anything wrong." May stepped away from the wall, hands visible and empty. "We're not here to take you anywhere." "Wick." The woman appeared in the doorway, the gun trained on May with hands that trembled. "You're lying. Reeves sent you, didn't he, to catch whoever's been stealing from him?" "He did," May admitted, "but that doesn't mean we're here to hurt you." "Then why are you here?" "To understand why," Elias said, stepping forward beside May despite the gun. "Why you're stealing, why you're living out here instead of in town, why that little girl looks like she hasn't had enough to eat in weeks." The woman's face crumpled, and for a moment May thought she might pull the trigger just to end the conversation, but instead she lowered the gun slightly, exhaustion winning out over fear. You want to know why? Because my husband died in a mine collapse 8 months ago, because the mining company said it was his fault for being careless and refused to pay any compensation. Because I tried to get work in town, but nobody wants to hire a woman with a child to care for. Because the winter's coming and I don't have money for food or supplies or... Her voice broke. I'm not stealing because I want to. I'm stealing because if I don't, my daughter starves. Silence fell over the clearing, broken only by the sound of wind through the broken cabin walls. What's your name? May asked quietly. Sarah. Sarah Chen. And your daughter? Lily. May looked at the cabin, at the pitiful supplies Sarah had managed to accumulate, at the thin face of the child peering out from behind her mother's skirts. She saw herself at 16, desperate and alone, making impossible choices to survive. She saw every person who'd ever been ground down by a system that valued profit over people, property over humanity. Elias, she said, go back to the mine. Tell Reeves we found his thief, and we're bringing her in tomorrow to discuss terms. Terms? Just tell him that. Elias looked between May and Sarah, understanding dawning on his face. What are you going to do? Something that might get us fired, but it's the right thing, so we're doing it anyway. She met his eyes. You trust me? He didn't hesitate. Yes. Then go. I'll meet you back in town before dark. After Elias left, May turned back to Sarah. Put the gun down. We need to talk. Sarah lowered the weapon completely, setting it on a barrel just inside the door. If you're going to turn me in, just do it. Don't drag it out. I'm not turning you in, but we can't leave things as they are either. Reeves hired us to solve his problem, and I keep my word. May moved closer, careful to keep her movements non-threatening. Here's what's going to happen. Tomorrow, you're going to come with me to see Reeves. You're going to admit what you did and return what you can. And then you're going to listen to the deal I'm going to propose. What deal? That's between me and Reeves. But Sarah, May's voice softened. I can't promise it'll work. I can't promise he'll agree. But I'm going to try to find a solution that doesn't end with you in jail or your daughter alone. Sarah stared at her, disbelief and hope warring on her face. Why would you help me? You don't even know me. No, but I know what it's like to be desperate, and I know what it's like when nobody helps. May pulled out half the money Reeves had given her, $12, and pressed it into Sarah's hand. Buy food for Lily, real food, not just what you can steal. Tomorrow we fix the rest. That night, back in the room above Abigail's establishment, Elias asked the question May had been expecting. What's your plan? I'm going to offer Reeves a trade. Sarah stops stealing from him, returns what she can, and in exchange she gets a job. Doing what? You said yourself nobody in town wants to hire a woman with a child. Nobody in town. But Reeves runs his mine with just his sons and a couple hired hands. They work underground all day, which means nobody's watching the surface, managing supplies, keeping inventory. That's why Sarah could steal so easily. There's no oversight. Understanding dawned on Elias's face. You're going to suggest he hire her to manage the surface operations. Exactly. She gets a wage, she gets to keep her daughter close, and Reeves gets someone trustworthy watching his supplies. Everyone wins. Except Reeves has to trust the woman who's been stealing from him for months. Which is why I'm going to offer him insurance. We'll stay on for a month, working alongside Sarah, making sure everything runs smooth. By the end of that month, either she's proven herself trustworthy or we've found evidence she can't be trusted. Elias was quiet for a long moment. And if he says no, then we take our $25 and walk away. But at least we tried. We'll lose the other $25 we were supposed to earn. Money's not everything, Elias. He smiled slightly. That's quite a change from the woman who won me in a poker game because she was good at calculating odds. People change. Situations change. She paused. You changed me, I think. Made me remember that survival isn't the same as living. The next morning, they met Sarah and Lily at the cabin and walked together to Reeves's mine. Sarah looked terrified, her hand gripping Lily's tightly, but she kept moving forward, kept putting one foot in front of the other. Reeves was waiting at the mine entrance, and his expression darkened when he saw Sarah. That's her? That's who's been stealing from me? Yes, May said. Sarah Chen. And before you say anything, let me lay out a proposal. She talked fast, outlining the plan she and Elias had discussed. To his credit, Reeves listened without interrupting, though his expression remained skeptical throughout. When she finished, he was quiet for a long time, his eyes moving from Sarah to Lily and back again. You're asking me to hire the woman who stole from me, he said finally. I'm asking you to hire someone who's desperate enough to risk jail to feed her child. That kind of desperation makes people do stupid things, yes, but it also means when you give them a legitimate option, they'll work harder than anyone to prove they deserve it. And if she steals again? Then you turn her in and I'll testify against her myself, but give her 1 month. Let her prove herself. Reeves turned to Sarah. Why should I trust you? Sarah's voice shook, but she met his eyes. Because I'm tired, Mr. Reeves. Tired of stealing, tired of running, tired of watching my daughter go hungry. You give me honest work for honest pay, and I swear on Lily's life I'll never take another thing that isn't mine. Your husband worked for the Harrison mine, didn't he? The one that collapsed last year? Yes, sir. I knew him. Not well, but I knew him. He was a good worker from what I heard. Didn't deserve what happened. Reeves sighed heavily. Against my better judgment, I'm going to accept this proposal. 1 month trial. You manage surface operations, inventory, supplies, maintenance. I'll pay you $20 a month plus room in the foreman's cabin. It's small, but it's weatherproof. Sarah's knees nearly buckled. Thank you. Thank you. Don't thank me yet. You've got to earn it. And Miss Crow here better be right about you, or we're all going to regret this. Over the next month, they fell into a rhythm that felt almost like normalcy. Sarah proved herself capable and trustworthy, managing Reeves's supplies with an efficiency that impressed even his skeptical sons. Lily started to fill out, the hollow look leaving her cheeks as regular meals became routine instead of luxury. May and Elias stayed in redemption, working odd jobs around town to supplement their dwindling funds. May hired out for tracking and hunting, bringing in meat that Abigail paid good money for. Elias discovered he had a talent for bookkeeping, and soon half the remaining businesses in redemption were paying him to organize their accounts. They still shared the room above Abigail's establishment, still ate meals together, still fell asleep to the sound of each other's breathing in the darkness. But something had shifted between them, subtle but undeniable. The careful distance had narrowed, the guarded conversations had opened up. They'd become something neither of them had words for yet. Not quite friends, not quite partners, but something that held elements of both and promised to become something more. One evening, 3 weeks into their month-long commitment, May found Elias sitting on the front steps of the building, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and purple. Mind if I join you? She asked. It's a free country, mostly. She sat down beside him, close enough that their shoulders almost touched. I've been thinking about what happens when the month is up. And I think Sarah's proven herself. Reeves trusts her now. She doesn't need us watching over her anymore. So we leave? We could take whatever money we've saved and move on. There's other towns, other jobs, other... She paused, choosing her words carefully. Other ways to live. Or we stay. Make something here. Redemption's dying, but it's not dead yet. And sometimes the best things grow in the hardest ground. Elias turned to look at her, surprise evident in his expression. You want to stay? You who can't sit still for more than a day, who always has one eye on the horizon looking for the next threat? Maybe I'm tired of running. Maybe I've found something worth staying for. She met his eyes. Or someone. The air between them went very still, charged with possibility. May, Elias said quietly. What are we? Really? I don't know. I won you in a card game, and somewhere along the way you stopped being a burden and started being... She struggled to find the right word. Essential, like water or air or... A partner? More than that. She took a breath, making herself vulnerable in a way she hadn't been since she was 16 years old. I told you about my father, about being sold. What I didn't tell you is that afterward, I promised myself I'd never belong to anyone again. Never be owned, never be controlled, never let anyone close enough to hurt me. And now? Now I realize that belonging to someone and choosing someone aren't the same thing. That being owned and being partnered aren't the same thing. That letting someone close enough to hurt you also means letting them close enough to... She stopped, the words catching in her throat. To love you? Elias finished softly. The word hung in the air between them, fragile and powerful and terrifying. Is that what this is? May asked. Love? I think it might be. For me, anyway. I can't speak for you. She thought about that. Thought about the past month, about shared meals and shared work and shared silence. Thought about the way her heart had nearly stopped when Dooley had threatened him. The way she'd been willing to bleed to keep him safe. The way his presence had become the thing she looked forward to at the end of each day. I think it might be for me too, she said finally. Though I've got no experience with it, so I can't be sure. Neither do I. We'll have to figure it out together. Together, she repeated, tasting the word. I like the sound of that. He reached out and took her hand. Not demanding, not possessive, just offering connection. She laced her fingers through his and held on. They sat like that as the sun finished setting and the stars began to emerge. Two people who'd started as a gambler's prize and a desperate bride seeker, who'd become something neither of them had expected and both of them needed. When the month ended, Reeves paid them the remaining $25 and offered them permanent positions if they wanted to stay. May politely declined, but suggested he might want to hire Elias to manage his books and accounts. You're not staying? Reeves asked, surprised. I'm staying in Redemption, just not working for you. She glanced at Elias. We're going to try something different. What they tried was building a life. With their combined savings and some creative negotiation with Abigail, they purchased the old assayer's office on the edge of town, a small building that needed work but had good bones. May hung a sign that read Crow and Ward, tracking, investigation, and accounts. It was an unusual combination of services, but in a town like Redemption, unusual was standard. They took cases that others wouldn't touch, finding lost livestock, tracking down claim jumpers, mediating disputes between stubborn miners who refused to talk to each other but would talk to neutral parties. Elias kept books for anyone who needed it, his neat columns and careful arithmetic bringing order to chaos. May did the work that required being outside, being tough, being the kind of person who could look danger in the eye and not blink. Together, they built something that worked. The contract that had started everything, the paper that said Elias Ward belonged to whoever held it, hung framed on the wall of their office. But May had taken a pen and written across it in bold letters, void by mutual agreement. One evening, 6 months after they'd arrived in Redemption, May came home to find Elias cooking dinner over their small stove, humming something that might have been a song from Philadelphia, or might have been something he was making up as he went. Good day? He asked as she hung up her hat and gun belt. Found the Morrisons' missing mule. Turns out it wasn't lost, just tired of being worked so hard and decided to take a vacation in the next valley over. Can't blame it for that. Neither could I. Told them they might want to give it a day off once a week, or they'll keep having this problem. She moved to stand beside him, looking at whatever he was stirring in the pot. What's for dinner? Abigail's venison stew recipe, or my interpretation of it anyway. Smells good. We'll see if it tastes good. She wrapped her arms around him from behind, resting her chin on his shoulder. Elias? I'm glad I won that card game. He turned in her arms, his hands finding her waist, his expression soft with the kind of contentment that came from finding home in another person rather than a place. I'm glad you won too, though I have to say, being someone's prize worked out better than I expected. You were never my prize. You were my choice. There's a difference. I know. That's what makes it work. They kissed then, gentle and sure, two people who'd started as strangers and become something infinitely more valuable, partners in every sense of the word. Outside, Redemption settled into evening, a dying town that refused to die completely as long as people like them kept breathing life into it. The future was uncertain, the path ahead unclear, but for the first time in their lives, neither May nor Elias was afraid of tomorrow. They'd built something from nothing, from a card game and a contract and two people who'd had nothing to lose. They'd built trust where there should have been ownership, partnership where there should have been possession, love where there should have been transaction. And if that wasn't proof that the frontier could still hold miracles, May didn't know what was.